welcome to CoronaNomics What Just Happened, brought to you by Econ Films, where we go through the biggest events of yet another historic week with you, our live audience. So please join the conversation on YouTube, comment, or on Twitter using hashtag CoronaNomics. I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
And I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent. Well, it's been another 7 busy days of coronavirus-related news. We had the spectacle of the UK Prime Minister laying into flip-flopping Islington Remainers. Perhaps it takes one to know one. We also had some bad news. A free trade deal with both the US and the EU, combined population 760 million by the end of the year, is now looking unlikely, we're told. But some good news as well. We've apparently made great progress on a post-Brexit trade deal with Liechtenstein, population 38,000. And this week, Dominic Cummings went for another eye test. Does anyone know the way to Barnard Castle?
Joining us this week for a trade special, Allie Renison, Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute Directors, and probably one of her dogs, and Peter Foster, Public Policy Editor at the Financial Times. Welcome to you both.
Well, we're going to go to our guest moments of the week shortly, but first of all, our regular audience poll on Twitter, which we'll discuss the results of towards the end of the show. So the question is, as Joe Wicks emotionally ends his daily live lockdown PE lessons for children, we want to know what you're going to miss most from lockdown as we come to the end. Is it Joe Wicks's live PE classes? Is it working at home in your pajamas? Is it number 3, not going to the office or even the school? Or is it, are you going to miss an excuse not to socialize? So those are your choices. Go on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV and cast your vote. And we'll discuss it towards the end of the show. But first of all, on to our moments of the week. Let's start with you, Peter. What caught your eye this week?
Yeah, pretty grim story, which was Make UK, which is the manufacturers' organisation, warning of a jobs bloodbath in the autumn. They have a rolling survey of their members, 20,000 in total that they have, not 20,000 that they survey, but 20,000 members. And 53% reckon that they will be making between 10% and 25% of their workforce redundant. Those are really grim numbers. And I think one of the things that struck me actually was that that's double the number of firms predicting heavy redundancies than 2 months ago. And, we talked earlier about Brexit, but all of that is going to be coming home to roost just at the moment when we're going to be making some very big decisions in Brussels. So that was my moment of the week. Pretty downbeat one, but there we are.
Yeah. Peter, let me ask you, is manufacturing special? Should we be looking to bail that out and preserve that more than other sectors of the economy? Because we had Ken Clarke last week, I think, saying the Chancellor can't and shouldn't try to save every job. You've got to be honest with business. Is manufacturing a special case?
Well, it's politically special potentially because it falls heavily in the red wall seats, doesn't it, in the Northwest and the Midlands. I think also sometimes manufacturing is somewhat underestimated because although it's only a relatively small fraction of the economy, when you add in supply chains and you add in where manufacturer is an intense employer and where manufacturer employs above average wages in key areas that the government's kind of target, manufacturing is not in secular decline, as one cabinet minister memorably said in January before coronavirus struck. Manufacturing is key, actually, to the UK economy, and we ignore it at our peril, I think.
Ali, I want to ask you, the industrial strategy is one of Theresa May's big things, but it seems to kind of be on the back burner with this government. Should they bring it back? Do you think they will?
I think it depends on what you mean by industrial strategy. The history is cast a long shadow, I think, in this country, particularly because of the experience of Jaguar Land Rover, decades ago under previous governments. So I think it depends on what you talk about. When we talk about an industrial strategy, is that picking winners? People tend to resile from that. Obviously, treasuries the world round tend to be slightly disinclined to do that kind of thing. I mean, it's different from should there be a bailout of these kind of companies to should there actually be an industrial strategy. And I think that actually if we let go of some of our conditioned views about what an industrial strategy has to be, looking at the sectors that are the most high growth, what can you do to facilitate them? I don't think that means obviously pouring huge amounts of government money into them. It means being smart and having a holistic strategy that looks at, what is needed to nurture these kind of things and not in a siloed kind of way. There was an interesting report a couple of years ago by one of the leading sort of life science experts in this country, Bell, and he looked at this and said, on the one hand, actually, there's a lot that the UK can do itself. There are certain conditions that are needed for it to really maximize its full potential. So, for example, is the chemicals or pharmaceuticals market, the UK market itself is obviously not big enough to be able to service that. So you have to look at what are the actual strategies you need to make sure that it maximizes its reach both at home and abroad. So that's what I think of when I think about an industrial strategy. But that's a different, if somewhat related question to whether these companies should actually be bailed out. And I think that it's important to conceive of the significance and strategic significance of having a manufacturing industry that's advanced manufacturing. Too often we think we're going to compete with China just on the exact kind of thing, and I think actually that's quite an outdated stereotype to some extent, that people think that China is actually just doing basic raw commodity type manufacturing. So I think if we think about it creatively rather than in sort of classical left-right divide, we would get a lot further.
Yeah, well, we're going to come on and talk about China later in the show. But first of all, we've got a live question from Sean, who's a factory worker from South Tyneside. And hello, Sean. He's got a question which is related to this whole area. What's your question, Sean?
Basically, my question is, what lessons have been learned from the recession in 2008, and how does that recession compare to the looming recession due to the coronavirus?
Yeah, well, I think all the projections are that it will make 2008 look like a sort of a dinner party, a picnic compared to what's going to happen this year. But Peter, I wonder if I can ask you, I mean, what comparisons do you draw between what's happening now and what happened in the financial crisis?
Well, two obvious ones, I think, is that austerity followed the financial crisis, the 2008 recession, which didn't cost the jobs that this recession looks like it's going to cost. And I think if you look at the European and the UK responses compared to the US responses, we were slow to learn, the lessons of the Great Depression and the credit crunch. I was based in Washington and China at the time, and they responded very differently. And I think we probably have learned those lessons this time around. And the Chancellor will do what it takes, even if it's not whatever it takes. Of course, the other big difference is that coronavirus, if we get the vaccine that we hope we're going to get, some good news from the Jenner Institute, the Oxford vaccine this week, may not be the structural recession. It's going to make some long-term changes, but it might not be the deep structural recession that followed the financial crisis. And actually, if we're sitting here a year from now, we might be much more cheerful than we are at the moment.
That's very interesting. I mean, Ali, what do you think? Is it possible when history is rewritten, or when history is written, that, as Peter says, 2008 could look worse in its long-term impact than this crisis?
I'm cautious about over-comparing the two, because not only are the origins so different. I mean, obviously, it takes nothing for confidence to be sapped out of the economy, no matter what context you're operating in. So that's certainly something that people are mindful of. But in terms of what's being done to demand and to take demand out of the economy, it's a different kind of beast, because it's such an artificial, in a way, intervention, and it's sort of unpredictable. So you could have a V-shaped recovery prediction tomorrow, and then if you have, depending on, again, it's going to be really interesting to see how these kind of localized, if we have localized shutdowns. We've never really had that kind of geographical artificial intervention in the economy in the same kind of way. It's sort of hard to predict where and how it's going to rebound, and yet you get this sort of underlining feeling that things could actually go back, not so much to normal, but it's really interesting to watch the response to some of the vaccines, because although companies aren't necessarily looking at every single day the updates and how to get there, things could change so quickly and be back to some kind of normalcy. So I think it's very, very different, the factors driving it, and therefore the outcome.
Yeah, and Sean, you were working in financial services back in 2008. Is that right?
Yeah, I was a mortgage underwriter back in 2008. So
Right.
when that sorry.
Yeah, I mean, how does it feel for you, having lived through and worked through both?
It's a little bit strange, and it's bringing back memories, so to speak. I lost absolutely everything after 2008 when I got made redundant. I now work for Nissan,
Right.
and I'm concerned that we're going to head down that same route, because not only have we got coronavirus, we've also got the issue of Brexit. So
absolutely.
I don't know if that's going to be the final nail in the coffin for that plant.
Yeah. Well, we obviously all hope not, and we're going to talk a bit more about Brexit later on, so do hang around. But thanks so much for coming on, Sean. We really appreciate it, and very best of luck to you. Don't forget to vote in our Twitter poll at CoronaNomics TV, and if you want to ask us a question, do so in the YouTube comments or on Twitter, #CoronaNomics.
We're going to do gents first this week. So, Ben, what was your moment of the week?
Well, Lizzie, my moment of the week was the breakthrough from Oxford University researchers in their search for a vaccine. Obviously, an incredibly encouraging moment, as Peter was saying, but also one which I fear sort of underlines some peculiar British pathologies. This obsession about, as you can see from that headline, whether we'll get it by Christmas. It seems like in big national moments, everything has to be done by Christmas, whether it's ending world wars or whatever. Also, Oxford's progress is being used as ammunition in this slightly tedious debate about whether the UK is world-beating or not. And I think that's a shame, because why can't we just aspire to mere competence? Why do we have to sort of be top of the tree? I think it's also interesting, and I've chosen it for my moment of the week, because obviously ministers are paying lip service here in the UK to the idea that a successful vaccine should be available to the entire world, and it shouldn't be the property of any one company or any one nation. And yet simultaneously, in recent days, they've been outraged about Russian and Chinese attempts to steal our vaccine secrets. Now, I don't want to diminish the importance of and the seriousness of hacking and industrial espionage, but there is an irony here, because one wonders slightly, what's the danger exactly? Is it that they'll get the vaccine and give it to their populations and help stem the tide of the pandemic? Is that really something to worry about? I think what it perhaps reveals is that we're getting pretty, I would say, meager levels of true international cooperation when it comes to dealing with this pandemic, despite the rhetoric. And that's the reason I chose it as my moment of the week, Lizzie.
Ali, I want to ask you, obviously there's a business side to the vaccine as well as the health side. Do you sense that the pharma industry expects to profit off coronavirus vaccines and medications? They say they won't, but is that accurate?
I think they know this time it's different to a certain extent, particularly from a governance angle. Just trying to get my dog out of the way. I really do think that I can't speak. I don't work for these companies, but there is a general sense, and I think that there will be an encouragement from wider industry, from life sciences and beyond, to say basically that I don't think it would be silly to expect that there will never be any kind of profit consideration or outcome out of that. I don't think that we should be under any illusion that these are companies that, after all, without their investment, and it's not just coming from government money, that we wouldn't have the vaccine in development at all. And so I think that we shouldn't pretend that there's not going to be some kind of eventual profit outcome, but that's not in the first instance what they're trying to do. The collective effort on speed at the moment, and I have to say on the Oxford vaccine, I don't normally often see this up in Scotland all the time, but it was interesting to see all of the scientific community up here was really hailing this as not only game-changing, but game-ending was the headline. And you don't hear scientists saying that very often. They're fairly cautious.
Great. Okay. Peter, do you want to ask a question?
One of the things I was thinking about, how this interacts with all this fear of redundancies. Ali, do you think that if we are approaching a really credible vaccine, right, and the stage 3 trials look like they're going to work, do you think there's an argument the Chancellor will buy to actually extend the furlough scheme and try and head off some of these redundancies, given that we may look closer to a V-shaped recovery in September, October, November than we do now, and they may have heat on from Brexit, etc.? Do you see that as a possibility?
Because you've threaded it together that way, yes. I do potentially, I suppose, but I think also that while confidence can be undone in a moment, I don't think confidence tends to rise back that quickly, and I'm not sure off the back of that the Chancellor would be that minded to premise and offer pretext base everything around linking it to having a hotline to Oxford to see what the latest is on the trials, for example. I think that would be fiscally irresponsible, and so I don't think he's basing everything around it, but I certainly think that and that's where it does help to have it being done in country, I suppose, to some extent. He may well have a hotline onto Oxford, and I think that there's nothing wrong with having a sort of a feedback loop to inform that, but I wouldn't say that it should be the driving factor. I wouldn't say that he would make it in that kind of causal effect, but because you threaded it together that way, you could see that happening in an outcome, not necessarily by intent, though.
Peter, you had a big scoop on the UK shunning cooperation with the EU on the vaccine scheme. Isn't that nuts? Is it pride before sense?
It's a good question there, and I think it's the same with the PPE business. The Jenner Institute actually had already negotiated a deal with 4 major EU states, and it's actually not that clear that the EU scheme would deliver better. I think what may cause concern is whether or not, because there are lots of other consortia around the place, right? So it doesn't have to be an EU scheme. I think where it may cause issues is if the Brits aren't going to share alike, and I think that will cause real tensions, because we're all safe when we're all safe. There's no point in just vaccinating your people if the COVID fires are raging in America or China. So there does need to be a really global approach to this, and therefore it doesn't necessarily mean the Brits have to join the EU scheme, because I'm not actually sure that is the best scheme, but we do need to be really clear that we need to be part of a global problem, because this is a global pandemic and it must have global solutions.
Yeah, I think as you were saying,
it comes back
vaccine.
I think to Ben's point.
Sorry, go.
I was going to say, it just comes back to Ben's point about, I think, a lot of things are announced, a lot of efforts are announced, both at EU and global level. A lot of sort of initiatives between different plurilateral kind of groupings or countries are announced. It's going to be interesting to see what ones actually club together. And keep in mind that the UK has actually signed up to be one of these 70, I think, are odd, under the Gavi vaccination program, self-financing countries that will try, it may just be a declaration, who knows, but that they will commit to equal access distribution globally. So, but lots of things are announced. The follow-through, including on the EU schemes, is not necessarily the same thing as the fanfare with which it launched.
Yeah, indeed. Well, obviously, a vaccine would be probably the biggest stimulus we could have to global growth at the moment. But in the absence of one, there is still this question which we've been talking about. How do you help businesses and individuals in the meantime? On that subject, we've got a pre-recorded question from Tess, who's an entrepreneur from Bradford.
Hi, I'm Tess, and I run a startup vegan catering company. And I'm just wondering what support you think needs to be out there for young people starting out in this sector when lots of cafes and restaurants are closing during the pandemic.
So, Ali, we've had obviously these these various schemes announced by the Chancellor as part of his jobs package. Do they help young entrepreneurs directly enough, do you feel?
It depends on whether you fall between some of the gaps in the relief schemes. I think some of the anachronisms in which the way in which business structures exist in the UK that just don't exist in other countries, like, for example, Ireland, mean that some of the schemes are actually it's not, there's no real catch-all scheme that catches everyone that you see in other countries like the continent, like Ireland, which has a temporary wage subsidy scheme which catches everyone, employers, employees alike, and it's not based on what kind of business structure you have or how you pay yourself. It's fairly sweeping. I don't think that's necessarily the fault of the Chancellor of the UK. I think it's the inherent set up of some of our just our ecosystem, our economic ecosystem, meant that it was difficult to catch everyone and make sure that you were doing it fairly. I also think that there is a difference in the UK. If you were to compare ourselves to Europe, I suppose, although it's worth mentioning with the US as well, if you were to compare ourselves to Europe, we don't have any big public investment banks, right? So they aren't standing behind a lot of this. We don't have that tradition. And so in I think the next phase, and certainly something that we're pushing really hard for at the IOD, is to try and make sure that the next economic recovery phase of schemes that are now being announced targets in the first instance the people who haven't been able to access any relief, because lots of directors, company directors, people who are freelancers, the kind of people we encourage to break from, the corporate structure and go off and do their business, are now being left out in the cold. So they should be, first in line ideally for anything that, and people who don't have commercial premises, it's just, there are going to have to be lots of little schemes if we're not going to find something sweeping to catch the people who are still being impacted by the government social distancing rules.
Well, thank you, Tess, for that question. And don't forget to vote in our poll. And if you've got a question, ask away on the YouTube comments or on Twitter using hashtag CoronaNomics. Now, Allie, your turn. What's your moment of the week?
So my moment, or it seems to be a rolling moment, a series of moments in this story, is the potential banning of TikTok in the US, which is this, I don't use it, my boyfriend's son uses it. Sort of, I guess, akin to something. Someone's going to correct me and tell me how horribly out of date and old I am, but I look at it as something similar to Snapchat, kind of. And so there's a lot of concerns similar to, I think, I don't think it's been as affected, but sort of Zoom, you've seen some concerns about information being handed over. And so TikTok is the latest that the US has in its sights. And I think that really, it's the next sort of step in the trade war, so to speak, is this sort of digital interface with trade, so to speak. And for a while, I think for the last, feels like up until now, we've really been able to keep what we can see of as classical trade and the digital space separate, but we're really seeing a fusing of that from a political space. And it will be really interesting to see whether the UK, which is certainly for, I think there are fairly justified political reasons, stepped up its direct engagement with China over Hong Kong and the security law that was passed there. But they've always been able to traverse a fairly careful line of, as far as possible, keeping the economic and the political separate, even if Beijing actions don't necessarily reflect that themselves. So it's going to be really interesting to see which way the UK is pulled down this way. We've already had the Huawei decision. Regardless of what you think about Huawei, the decision to change it was fairly political, and that clearly has economic ramifications. So from a business perspective, I think the last thing I would say on that is, we don't want to be in a situation where we're sort of forcing companies to divest just for the sake of it being in China, but we may end up getting there indirectly because the social pressure is so great. And purely from as much as I hate to say it, risk mitigation perspective as a company, you don't want to be caught up in political wars when they turn economic and retaliatory. So people may have to indirectly end up just spreading their basket a lot more rather than the government forcing them.
We've actually got a live question on this issue from Parvan, one of our most loyal viewers, and he's in Vancouver, and we've been trying to get him on for weeks. Hi Parvan, thanks for joining us.
Hello. Hi Lizzie and Ben, it's great to be on, and I'm glad to be here with Peter and Allie. They're really great. So my question is, we talked about the treatment of TikTok in the US and in other companies. I'm wondering about the ability of, American digital firms to do business in other countries in Asia as they compete with the Chinese giants. So I mean, most interestingly, I'm wondering about, is there space for homegrown countries or companies mostly in India, but, in Vietnam or Indonesia or Thailand to grow in that space? Will they be championed by their own national governments so they don't have to choose sides between the two?
Peter, this was your patch of the world for a long time. What do you think?
I think it's going to be extremely difficult. Governments will champion. When I was in China 2009, 2012, I think the jury was still somewhat out. During that period, Google left because it couldn't handle the censorship. But the China of Xi Jinping is a really fundamentally different China than the China of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And I think you are really now seeing two really bifurcated ecosystems developing between China and the US. And the problem with Huawei is that there is no transparency, and it's the same issue with TikTok. There is no trust or transparency about where the data is going. Huawei, I don't think, would meet the listing requirements on a London Stock Exchange, for example. And so when you're in a situation where the politics in America map across really kind of competing interests in China. You're seeing a world, I think, that it wasn't clear we were going to enter when I was in China in 2012 when I left, but we definitely have now. And the political situation is genuinely different. I think what's happening in Hong Kong is a real challenge, a really difficult one. And what's happening in Xinjiang, I was in Xinjiang in 2009 when there was the kind of Uyghur, slaughter is the right word, of a lot of Han Chinese in Urumqi, the capital. And we've gone from that point where there is a cultural genocide taking place in Xinjiang. And it's, I guess you could argue, well, that was kind of going on in Tibet in some way, but these choices are getting starker and starker. We made our Faustian bargain with China, but they really are getting really, really difficult, I think, to talk about finessing them, etc. Children are being taken away and literally having their culture erased from their minds by the Chinese in a really systematic way. And, one country, two systems, we're going to have one world and two systems, I think, and marrying the two is going to be just more and more difficult.
Allie, could you come in on this?
I think
you said it's a way to on.
Yeah, on sort of who can potentially step in. It's interesting too. I always try and the U.S. I kind of put in a box because I've grown up there. I know what the U.S. attitude to China is. It's been a long-standing thing. It's sort of around human rights, but it's really about I don't want to say a civilizational battle, but it's very much economic superpower. Who's going to lead what part of the world and whatnot. So I tend to look particularly at what some of the countries closer to China are doing, and Japan, and are they taking this with a pinch of salt, or are they reacting? And Japan is reacting. Japan has I saw in Nikkei in the last couple of days that they are moving to basically subsidize companies to operate in other markets. Japanese companies to operate in non-Chinese markets as well, which is interesting, actually, a change, because very often you think of, well, how do we build up competition? And I know this, we're talking about digital, but traditionally, the argument has been, do you put tariffs on something to defend your own industry and reduce reliance on X? But now, we're starting to see, I think, countries reacting closer to China, and I think it'll be interesting to see the UK take its lead from that. And will the consortia of potentially Ericsson and Sony end up being something that we buy into? Will there be a Five Eyes type of arrangement between ourselves, the UK, the US, New Zealand, and Australia and Canada, to try and, even if it's not economically rational, and there are better, Huawei would work out as a sort of better value for money for the taxpayer, would it actually end up, is that going to matter less? Is value for money and economic criteria just going to suddenly stop mattering? And if so, what kind of framework do we need? I think for companies, it's going to be a pretty unpredictable next couple of years. I think I agree with Peter that the choices, not only for governments, but unfortunately, accordingly, for companies, are becoming a lot starker.
Parvan, it's really great to finally have you on. Thank you so much for your question. I hope that answered it well.
Yes, thank you so much, Parvan. He's frozen there. Anyway, don't forget to vote in our poll. We've still got time at CoronaNomics TV. If you've got a question for us, ask us on YouTube or Twitter, #CoronaNomics. Now, Lizzie, on to your moment of the week.
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, Ben, in the world of trade, we've double disappointment this week. The FT reported that the UK's abandoned hopes of a US trade deal by the end of the year. One trade expert, Sam Lowe, said it was pie in the sky to think that that'd be possible by the end of the year. And the Telegraph reported that Britain was close to abandoning hope of a Brexit trade deal. Allie, Liz Truss on the one of the House of Lords committees today said that the government had never publicly committed to a timeline for a US deal. But the Tory manifesto ahead of the December election did promise to cover 80% of trade with free trade agreements by 2022. So given how much UK trade is covered by the EU and the US, isn't that a bit of backpedaling from her now? Doesn't the government need to compete one or the other or both to hit that manifesto pledge?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I'd have to go back and look at the detail. I think it was, I guess it clashes up against, if you're focusing on the detail, do you care about whether she was talking about FTAs or X% of trade covered by trade deals? I mean, it's worth raising. I think from a From my own perspective, from a business perspective, I care a lot less. All I care about is making sure that they're the right deals, quite frankly, at the end of the day. And if the government has, seen the light that actually that it's what's in a trade deal that matters and not just having one. And I think it's also strategic, even if that strategy is evolving. Keeping in mind also that, to some extent, depending on what level of ambition you do or don't have for the EU deal, and you sometimes get different flickers in different directions depending on what part of government you listen to for the EU one. But if you do the US one first and you lay a marker down in the sand, that potentially means that you have to give the EU better access in some areas depending on what the MFN clauses are in there. So the reason I raise that is to say that it's, I certainly don't have a problem with the government taking an approach that says we're going to make sure that we don't just focus on a quick win. We do care about the future of trade policy in this country, that we're not going to ram something through just for the sake of it. Because I think people know that a US trade deal is pretty contentious. There's no beating around the bush. It's not New Zealand. It's not Australia. The EU one, it's you could say there's a little bit of inconsistency there, although the terms of transition do put us in a different stead to dealing with the US to some extent. So as long as the government is focused on the content and the outcome, if they have resiled from timescale commitments, I am less than bothered, to be completely honest.
Peter, you did one of your famous threads today, and now Michel Barnier is saying that a deal is unlikely as well, after all the high hopes of last month. So what's the true state of the negotiations? Is it all just spin? Is that why the British government's giving signals that it's going to be a no deal?
There's a certain amount of bluffology involved in that. I think, there was some progress on the governance section today. I think they're going to find a way of creating a strategic partnership agreement, but ring fencing some of the areas where you can see cross-cutting retaliation, which is what the Brits don't want. The big issue, and it won't come as a surprise, is about state aid. I think there is a real philosophical gulf between the two sides on state aid. Dominic Cummings doesn't want to be encumbered. There's a real block in Downing Street. So what you see essentially is the government kind of running around in circles. So it wants to do a trade deal with the States, and now it doesn't because it runs into the animal welfare situation. It wants to do a quick deal with the EU. Do you remember back in June we were going to put a tiger in the tank? And then it showed up in Brussels for 3 weeks in London and said nothing. And it said nothing because it really can't get past this state aid issue. The UK position is basically we will have a subsidy regime that will be based on the concepts of WTO subsidy, and we'll tell you what we subsidise every couple of years, and you can sanction us if you want to. Right? That is, in a nutshell, the UK offer. And I think Barnier was really clear again today that you heard London Downing Street talking about we're going to have the hardest of hard Canadas. It doesn't matter. The EU is going to need some kind of setting out of shared philosophy on state aid in that agreement before you even get to start to talk about the dispute resolution mechanism. And the rest of it falls into place. The governance mechanism, fish is a problem, but ultimately it's less than 1% of GDP. Boris needs a win on fish. The French just need to make sure that French mission aren't burning Brittany down. But I do think fish can be fixed by essentially agreeing that the Brits are going to get more fish. The Commission will give up on the status quo. Barnier will have to get a new mandate from the member states because they pushed him too hard on that. But I don't see fish blowing the whole thing up. State aid is absolutely core. State aid is a proxy for what Brexit means. And Johnson is going to have to decide in August, September, whether or not having a free hand on state aid, as Cummings would really want, is worth a no deal. And I think, that is the basic decision. And the minute that decision's made, the minute the key is turned on that, and we get in the room and the Brits want to talk Turkey, I think there are absolute deals to be done quickly. But until that really fundamental decision is made, we're stuck. And I think a deal will be done. I think it has to be done. But I do think that they are philosophically in very different places, and it's not as easy as people think.
Yeah, well, what a great overview. And you heard it here. Peter Foster thinks a deal will be done. So we'll keep an eye on that one. Now, we're coming towards the end, so we're going to go and get the results of our audience poll. A reminder of what the question was: what will you miss most from lockdown? Would it be Joe Wicks's PE classes, which ended this week? Would it be working at home in your pajamas? Will it be not going to the school or to the office? Or will it be not having an excuse not to socialize? So let's see which one on Twitter. Oh, fancy that. An excuse not to socialize. Now, Lizzie, I'm going to ask you, because that sounds pretty antisocial to me. But who would have?
That's so honest.
Who possibly would want an excuse not to socialize?
Me! I'm happy with my husband and my dog. And, you know, luckily for me, I've got a very social job where I don't get off the phone all day long and then I spend my evening doing this. So I think of myself like a sim, and I have my social bar, and my social bar is fully at the top. I don't need to go to the pub. I'm perfectly happy till there's a vaccine. Yeah. How about you, Allie?
Yeah, I'm in a weird situation because I was commuting anyways and kind of working from home up in Scotland up here, which is sort of but it's different to, you know, as much as I carped and moaned about basically having to commute up and down every week. I definitely miss being out of not even being out of the countryside, just seeing other people besides my immediate other half. And I love the dogs and the new puppy and everything, but I need a drink with friends. So I'm in two minds about it. If I was living in London, I would definitely say it was an excuse not to socialize. I literally, and the last thing I'll say on that is, throughout the entirety of the World Cup last year or two, basically, I made promises to go and watch it with people, and I was so exhausted from work that every single time I just watched it from my hotel room in London. So I feel Lizzie on that.
Peter, we've been seeing your byline in the FT down in Brighton, which is an unusual one for the FT. How's Brighton been through lockdown?
It's been pretty blissful, actually. I go swimming every day. Mustn't crow, but I go swimming every day. And the sun is shining, and I get on the South Downs when I want to. So that's all good. I like working in my pajamas, but I am keen to go back. I put a shirt on, 8 o'clock. I had to put the shirt on, so smarten up for the show. But I am keen to go back, and I think what I'm hopeful that actually we end up with a happy medium, and I probably end up not doing 5 days a week as I was, but 3 days a week.
Yeah.
Because I think what's going to happen is that what's been amazing, actually, from a journalist's point of view, is the FT has this sort of slightly strange thing where it likes to byline you absolutely where you are, you know, opposite the corner of whatever, you know. But it's all been fine, actually, because social media networks are incredible. You know, what you can do on Twitter, really, you can break stories, you can reach out to people. But I think that will evaporate, won't it, when we're all back in our offices. If I'm sat in my house in Brighton saying, do you mind if we do a Zoom call? And then we'll go, well, no, we're all in the office, mate. You know, you've got to come in. You know, you've got to get with the programme. And then I'll get terrible fear of missing out, and I'll be straight back up on the train to London. So I don't
Southern Rail.
We're Zooming forever.
Yeah, indeed.
One thing I could do with a flexi pass is because actually it would be much better modern commuting. We had some kind of flexi system where you could just buy journeys as you need them, rather than this ridiculous whole year ticket.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think my main thing about lockdown is I think the fear of missing out, as you were sort of suggesting, Peter, has gone down in this period because you know that everyone's in the same boat. Well, it's been a great show. Thanks.
Well, then I'm about to have a massive FOMO then. It's up in Scotland as everyone goes back.
Oh no, yeah. Well, we're connected by CoronaNomics, so that's good. We'll have you on again. So thanks so much to Allie and Peter for joining us this week, and thanks to everyone at home for watching and sending in questions. Do keep them in. Pavan is an example of what can be achieved through perseverance. So keep in touch.
And don't forget to catch our latest episode on decentralising power with the former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Raghu Rajan, an absolute hero of economics, which is available on our YouTube channel, and you can catch up with that now. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV for all our latest updates.
Now, as usual, our outro is going to be played by former CoronaNomics live guest Lord Stuart Wood, a huge Jethro Tull fan. Get on Twitter if you don't understand what we're talking about. But he's going to play us out as usual. Take it away, Lord Wood.